This is World Civilization. My name is Dr. Long. This video is entitled The Crusades in Global Context. The Crusades are typically thought of as a series of wars between Christians from Western Europe and Muslims in the Middle East, and these wars are considered to have largely occurred between the 11th and 14th centuries CE. Now, while this is true, I hope to show in this video that the Crusades belong in a broader global context. The term crusade is actually a modern term. It was not used widely in the Middle Ages. It derives from the Latin cruce signate, or one who wears the cross, a term that occasionally was used in the 12th century, but not very broadly. And modern times have been transformed into the word crusade and more commonly used. Historian Thomas Madden points out in his book, The Crusades, A Concise History, that many modern people view the Crusades, or any religiously motivated violence, for that matter, with disdain and derision. This is because the idea of killing for one's religion is alien to the mindset of many modern Westerners, particularly Americans with our First Amendment notions of freedom of religion and separation of church and state. And many modern Westerners don't take religion as seriously as some people did in the Middle Ages, or they don't see it as relevant as some people in the Middle Ages did. On the other hand, the modern world, and especially the 20th century, has been incredibly violent itself, even using tools provided by science and technology to inflict such violence. Many millions have fought and died in modern wars for causes such as nationalism, communism, or democracy. Perhaps we moderns simply have our own gods that we view as worthy of sacrifice. Modern causes that have resulted in bloody wars would seem trivial or absurd to medieval Europeans. So while on the one hand we may see religious motivated violence in the Middle Ages as horrific, many people in the Middle Ages would be puzzled by the violence that we have in the modern age. For instance, dying for one's country might be seen as trivial by a medieval crusader. During the Middle Ages, the period from 500 to 1500 CE, that's the period between the ancient world and the modern world, the biggest conflict between two world religions was between Christianity and Islam, with Islam largely having the upper hand in this period. Islam in part spread peacefully from Muslim merchants from the Middle East trading to parts of West Africa, East Africa, India, China, and Indonesia. However, Islam also spread through conquest, including conquest of many previously Christian lands. The Arab conquest that occurred in the 100 years after Muhammad spread Islam all the way through North Africa to Spain in the west, to Persia, Asia Minor, and Mesopotamia in the east. And these were finally halted in the west when Frankish warrior Charles Martel stopped an invading Arab army in France in 732 at the Battle of Tours. Likewise, in the east, the Byzantine Empire stopped invading Muslim armies in Asia Minor, also around the 8th century. In the ensuing centuries, Christians managed to push Muslims back further from a few other places. For instance, by 1085, in Spain, Christian forces took back the city of Toledo, beginning a long war of what Spanish Christians saw as a liberation of their homeland from Arab and Muslim rule. And this war was called by the Spanish the Reconquista, or the reconquest of their homeland Spain. In 1212, Christian forces in Spain won the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa against Muslim forces. The Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa was a dramatic battle in which Christians in Spain would then get the upper hand over Arab Muslims in Spain. It was a decisive battle. Christians would then capture Seville and reduce Muslims to the territory of Granada in the south. The Reconquista was finally completed in 1492 when Granada itself was conquered. And this long fight against Muslims in Spain made Spanish Catholicism more militant and aggressive. And as we'll see, this would have a big impact on the rest of the world. Spain's militant Catholicism would be important in conflicts later in Europe and would be taken to the New World by Columbus in 1492, influencing the brutal nature of Spanish conquest in the New World. Besides Spain, in 1092, the Normans, who were Christians from France, conquered Sicily. Sicily was an important island off the coast of southern Italy, and it had come under Arab and Muslim rule in the 9th century. So the reconquest of Sicily by the Normans was also an example of Christians taking back land lost to Muslim conquest. But then, in 1071, a Turkish army crushed the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert and captured the Byzantine Empire. The Battle of Manzikert in 1071 was a decisive battle. The Turks, who were Muslim, took over almost all of Asia Minor from the Byzantine Empire, which was predominantly Greek and Christian. This was a crushing blow to the Byzantines, as Asia Minor was a main source of their tax base, food, and a recruiting base for soldiers. Now, after the disastrous loss at the Battle of Manzikert, the next Byzantine emperor, Alexios Komnenos, sent a message to the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, who was the head of the Western Church. And this Byzantine Empire requested military assistance from Western Europe. The message arrived to Pope Urban II, who would come to urge Christians in Europe to take up the crusade to beat back Muslims from the Byzantine Empire. Pope Urban II would preach at the Council of Clermont in 1095 in France, urging Christian nobles and knights to put aside their own quarrels in Western Europe and go to the Holy Land, into the Byzantine Empire, and to liberate it from Muslims who were oppressing their fellow Christians. Urban said it was God's will to fight Muslims and protect fellow Christians. Urban II also hoped to use a crusade to patch up relations between the Western Church and the Greek Christian Church in the Byzantine Empire, as that relation had become strained. Crusading in Western Europe, increasingly after Urban's calls for crusade, came to be seen as a way to defend fellow Christians in the East. By the 12th and 13th centuries, 500 to 600 years after Muhammad, Islam had conquered what was 3/4 of the Christian world. So in Europe itself, crusades in the Holy Land took on a defensive purpose and a religious purpose. Crusades were called with Europeans to help out their fellow Christians in mind. In Europe itself, there were also crusades called. There were crusades called to stamp out remaining pagans along the Balkans. This was known as the Great Northern Crusade. Likewise, the use of the Inquisition and a military campaign in Spain was used to root out the Albigensians. The Albigensians were a group in Spain and France that denied the divinity of Christ and taught that the physical world was evil. And the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages considered the Albigensians a dangerous heresy. So a crusade was called to stamp them out as well. And again, the Inquisition was used as part of this crusade. In a few cases, people in Europe, also inspired by this idea of crusading, whether in Europe itself or in the Holy Land, also massacred Jews because they were the nearest non-Christian people to them. Still, by and large, while there was crusading in Europe, the Crusades were largely a conflict seen against Muslim aggression in the Middle East and against the Byzantine Empire. And the main conflict, indeed, was in the Middle East and in the Holy Land. As historian Bernard Lewis argues, as a concept, the crusade was considered a limited concept and a delayed concept to the Muslim idea of jihad. In Western Europe, the response to Pope Urban II's call for crusade was overwhelming. Christian warriors, nobles, and knights took vows as pilgrims to go on crusade. Many of them who did so spent fortunes paying for the crusade. It was very expensive. Others died on crusade, paying with their life. Christian civilians in Western Europe were likewise encouraged to pray, fast, and give money towards crusades. A popular preacher named Peter the Hermit led a mob of civilians from France all the way to Asia Minor, intending to go on the crusade. The Turks massacred most of them and enslaved the rest. It was a total disaster. Now, a more disciplined army of Western Europeans, after Pope Urban II's call, arrived in the Byzantine Empire in 1096. They did not get along with the Byzantines, who they were supposedly sent to protect, and amazingly then proceeded on to the Holy Land. In the Holy Land, they endured incredible hardships. But in June 1099, they took Jerusalem, while tragically massacring all the civilians they found there, including both Muslims and Jews. Now this march from the Byzantine Empire all the way to the Holy Land and capture of Jerusalem has been called the First Crusade. After the First Crusade, which largely from a military point of view was a success, European crusaders set up what were called the Crusader states, or the Latin kingdoms in the Levant, or the Holy Land. However, of the 40,000 soldiers who went on the First Crusade, only 2,300 stayed behind to garrison the Crusader states. Part of the reason for the success of the First Crusade was that Muslims in the Levant had been divided and were actually fighting among themselves. But that began to change after the First Crusade, and Muslims began to take back the land they had lost from Western European Christians. A second crusade was thus called in Europe to try to beat back this Muslim advance, but very little was accomplished because of the Second Crusade. In the 1170s and 1180s, Saladin, a Kurd and a devout Muslim who was determined to push the Crusaders out of the Levant entirely, took command of Muslim forces. And Saladin was an impressive warrior, an impressive leader as well. He inflicted a huge defeat on Western European Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, and then retook Jerusalem itself. The Battle of Hattin was thus a major turning point in the Crusades and a major victory for Muslims. A third crusade was called after Saladin's recapture of Jerusalem. Now it was led by prominent Western European leaders, monarchs such as Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Richard I, also known as the Lionheart, the King of England. The Third Crusade, however, was a complete disaster. Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, drowned while on the way to the Holy Land. For his part, Richard, the Lionhearted, the King of England, fought Saladin and managed to erase some of his gains, but Richard failed to recapture Jerusalem. A fourth crusade was then called. And in the Fourth Crusade, a rival claimant to the throne of the Byzantine Empire convinced Crusaders to go to Constantinople and overthrow the government there. Crusaders who were eager to get to the Holy Land were reluctant, but they needed money to pay for their voyage. So they decided to go to Constantinople in search of money and to help this rival claimant to the throne of the Byzantine Empire take power. That did not work out. They did help this rival claimant to the throne take power and become the new emperor, but he had little money and refused to pay them. Crusaders became enraged and ultimately sacked Constantinople in an orgy of violence and looting. Now this is a great irony. The Crusades had originated to defend Christians in the East, Christians in the Holy Land or the Levant, and Christians in the Byzantine Empire. But in the Fourth Crusade, Western European Crusaders actually sacked Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the heart of Greek Eastern Christianity. This was such a disaster that the Pope at the time, Pope Innocent III, who had also called for a crusade, excommunicated Western European Crusaders for their actions in sacking the city of Constantinople. So the Fourth Crusade thus ends in complete debacle, with Crusaders sacking Constantinople. The sack of Constantinople weakened the Byzantine Empire, which also had internal problems, and the Ottoman Turks would finally destroy the Byzantine Empire when they captured Constantinople in 1453. Now further crusades were called, such as the Fifth Crusade in Egypt, but it did not amount to much either. Calls for crusades continued, both from popes and from political leaders in Europe, all the way into the 16th century. But with the Protestant Reformation, Protestants came to associate crusading with the papacy and were not interested in it. Even Catholics began to lose interest in Islam and in crusading by the 16th century. Still, in the Middle Ages, the Crusades consumed an enormous amount of energy and resources in Western Europe. Famous rulers such as Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire and Richard of England, the Lion-Hearted, as well as Louis IX of France, otherwise known as Saint Louis, went on crusade. Entire orders of warrior monks, such as the Knights Templar and the Knights of Malta, the Knights Hospitallers, were all formed to support the Crusades. Religious figures such as Pope Urban II, Pope Innocent II, and popular preachers such as Bernard of Clairvaux all called for crusades throughout much of the Middle Ages. St. Francis of Assisi, one of the most famous Christian saints of Western Europe in the Middle Ages, went to Egypt, where he preached to the Sultan in an unsuccessful effort to convert him to Christianity. Now, the Crusades did not succeed in their objectives, but they did make Europeans more curious about the rest of the world, and they brought them into closer contact with the East, the Islamic world, and the Byzantine Empire, which they supposedly went on crusade to defend. At the time, those areas of the world had larger cities and were much more advanced than Western Europeans. While the Crusades were a big deal for Europeans, they were mainly a nuisance for Muslims. As historian Thomas Madden notes, the Crusades were largely forgotten in Muslim lands, as they were considered victories against minor barbarians. The first accounts of the Crusades in Arabic was not written until 1899. There was no long memory of the Crusades in the Middle East. Rather, the Crusades have been brought up in recent years by Arab nationalists and radical Islamists such as Osama bin Laden in order to criticize Israel and Western powers such as the United States. Bin Laden, for his part, labeled American soldiers Crusaders, while Saddam Hussein once even compared himself to Saladin. In short, bringing up the Crusades makes it easier for radicals to blame the West today for one thing or the other. But the real danger to the Islamic world during the Middle Ages wasn't the Crusaders. The real danger was the Mongols. As historian Philip Jenkins writes in his book, The Lost History of Christianity, the Mongols were, quote, a lethal enemy whose activities made the Western Crusades look like flea bites. Christians in Western Europe had stories about a legendary king somewhere in the East named Prester John. Now, there was no king in the East named Prester John. But when Christians in Western Europe first heard about the Mongols and their leader Genghis Khan, they hoped and prayed that he was Prester John, or at least someone they could ally with against the Islamic world. In 1246, Pope Innocent IV sent a letter to Genghis Khan attempting to convince him to convert to Christianity. Likewise, while on crusade in the Holy Land in the 1250s, King Louis IX of France attempted to open up negotiations for an alliance with Genghis Khan. The Mongols completely rejected all the appeals from Western Europeans outright. They weren't especially interested in Christianity either. They made it clear to Louis IX that they considered him a petty chieftain, a ruler of a small, unimportant kingdom, France, that the Mongols would conquer or assimilate in due time. While the Mongols never got to France, they did attack territories in the Islamic world. Indeed, in 1258, a Mongol army led by Hulagu, the grandson of Genghis Khan, sacked Baghdad. In the sack of Baghdad, the Mongols obliterated the city, killing up to 800,000 people in one of the most brutal sacks in human history. Now, Baghdad was a glorious city. It was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, the center of the Arab world culturally at the time. Its destruction was a huge blow to the Arab world and to Islamic civilization in general. The Mongols also conquered Syria, but in 1260s, the Mamluk regime that controlled Egypt decisively defeated the Mongols and took Syria back from them. And this was the first time that any army had stopped the Mongols. Now, this victory also made Mamluk Egypt the most important Muslim state in the world, particularly after the sack of Baghdad and the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. Nonetheless, as previously noted, the sack of Baghdad was a traumatic event for the Muslim world. It made Muslims less confident, as they had been before, and more fearful of potential enemies in their midst. It also caused Muslims to become less tolerant and less open to learning new things. In the long run, less curious about scientific and technological advances. As a result of their fears, Muslims also turned on minority Christian populations in the East, in places such as Syria, Mesopotamia, and Egypt, treating minority Christian populations as potential internal enemies, scapegoating them for their problems, and persecuting them horribly. This greatly reduced the number of minority Christian communities in the East. Unfortunately, the sack of Baghdad wasn't the only trauma that the Islamic world experienced in this era. As with China and Western Europe, the bubonic plague ravaged the Islamic world in the 14th century, killing up to 1/3 of the population in places such as Syria and Egypt. Large cities such as Cairo, Egypt, were especially hit hard. Next, in the 14th and 15th centuries, Tamerlane, who ruled from 1370 to 1405, and who was also a Mongol and a descendant of Genghis Khan, led armies that ravaged the Islamic world. Although Tamerlane was himself a Muslim, he accused other Muslims who resisted his conquest as being bad Muslims, and he called himself the Sword of Islam. Tamerlane's conquests were especially brutal, killing thousands of civilians and leaving piles of skulls behind. Tamerlane attacked India, Persia, Mesopotamia, the Ottoman Turks in Asia Minor. He killed upwards of 17 million people, most of whom were fellow Muslims. Tamerlane thus brought further death and chaos to the Islamic world. So clearly, Mongol leaders such as Hulagu and Tamerlane, not to mention the bubonic plague, were far more destructive to the Islamic world than were the Western European Crusaders. So let's draw some conclusions. The Crusades were a series of wars rooted in religious and civilizational differences between Christianity and Islam. Differences that went back to the rise and spread of both Christianity and Islam. The Crusades thus had deep roots, with European Christians at the time seeing them primarily as a defensive measure and as an act of religious devotion. Both sides committed violent actions, including awful massacres of civilians. European Christian crusaders ultimately failed on their objectives. And so much of this violence accomplished little. Violence both in Europe itself and in the Middle East. So why did the Western Crusaders fail? Well, first, in the Middle East, they were fighting in a distant land that was far away from their home. And they were also fighting against a superior enemy. Also, they were not united. Crusaders often fought amongst themselves. There was never any clear leader of the Crusades. Crusaders also did not get along with the Byzantines, who were supposedly there to help protect. With all this said, it's little wonder that they fell. The tragic irony is that the Crusades greatly hurt those they were intended to help, namely the Byzantines and other Eastern Christians who ended up being persecuted in the aftermath of the Crusades. Unfortunately, similar persecutions have befallen minority Christian populations in the Middle East since the 2003 American invasion of Iraq destabilized the Middle East. Over time, Christians have thus become even more of a minority in the Levant, the land in which Christianity originated, or the Holy Land. As an interesting side note comparison, Buddhism also spread outside of India, its land of origin. Like Christianity, Buddhism also became a minority religion in its land of origin. For Muslims, the Crusades were easily fought off. At the time, the Mongol invasions, however, were much more destructive and traumatic to the Islamic world. While the Crusades were largely forgotten in Muslim lands in the centuries after they ended, Arab nationalists and Islamic radicals have found them politically useful in recent decades to score points against the West. But this is ahistorical. The Crusades belong to the medieval world, a world with mentalities that are alien to many modern peoples. Still, while we cannot ignore the senseless violence and massacres of the Crusades, modern people should be cautious in judging the Crusades, especially as the modern world is hardly without very bloody wars in the name of causes that moderns hold dear, such as nationalism and democracy. For better or for worse, people are often willing to fight, kill, and die for things that they hold dear. In the Middle Ages, this often included religion. In the modern world, this includes things like, again, democracy and nationalism. These things differ over time, obviously. Finally, Between their connections to the Islamic world, Europe, and the Mongols, and even the Spanish conquest of the Americas, the Crusades were wars with truly global implications. So I'll stop here. Thanks for watching.